everyone, welcome to week 2 of Tography 101. This week we're going to be talking about the building blocks that make up manual mode. This includes ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. All three of these things work together to get the picture outcome that we would like. So when you understand how the three of them work together, you're able to better set your camera no matter what lighting situation that you face. So the first thing that I always set is aperture. This is what causes that blurry background. I know that a lot of you guys have been talking about wanting to get that blurry background. Aperture is the way to do it. A lot of times you'll hear this referred to as an f-stop because it is f and then a number or a decimal. So I personally like to shoot at f 3.5, sometimes 3.2, because I tend to get the most in focus at that aperture. I know a lot of photographers that shoot at 1.8 or 2.8 and they get great aperture, they get great focus. I personally can't get my focus that great, and so I choose to bring mine up just a little bit higher. The reason that your aperture setting affects your focus is your aperture is telling your camera how much space to get tack sharp. And so if you have a lower aperture, the space that is going to be tack sharp is going to be smaller. That's what causes the blurry background because that part's not in focus. And so with a lower f-stop or a lower aperture, the space that's in focus is smaller. So let's say that you have a low aperture and you're focusing on their eye. A lot of times you'll notice that the eye will be tack sharp and then other parts of the picture will be kind of soft where it's not as sharp. That's because of the low aperture. I tend to like to get at least the whole face sharp, sometimes some of the body. The background, obviously, I don't mind having blurry or soft, but I like my subject's face and a lot of the body to be tack sharp. So I choose to go about 3.2 to 3.5 aperture. You can test out your aperture on your camera to see kind of what that looks like. Bring it way down and then bring it way up to see the difference in those photos. What happens when you have a lower aperture is it lets in more light into your lens. So when you lower your aperture, meaning a lower number, more light is let into your photo and it's brighter. When you raise that aperture, less light is let into your photo, and so it tends to be darker. So that's kind of your give and take with your aperture. If you bring it up higher, it's going to be darker. If you bring it down lower, it'll be brighter, but the area that's tack sharp is going to be smaller. When you're setting your aperture, one thing to consider is how many people are in your photo. If you have a group that's larger, you want to bring that aperture up higher. If you have a group that's smaller, maybe just 1 or 2 people, you can have that lower aperture. When I shoot a family, let's say it's a family of 5, I tend to bring my aperture up to about 4. That's because I want the whole family to be tack sharp, not just the one person that I'm focusing on. So to get that bigger, sharper area, I need to bring up the aperture. So to review, aperture, the lower that you go, the more light that's let in, but the smaller the focus area. The higher the aperture, the less light that's let in, but the greater the focus area. The next thing that we're going to talk about is your shutter speed. When I go to a shoot, the order that I set my settings is aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and then I go back to my shutter speed, and I'll explain why in just a second. But when you're talking about your shutter speed, that's the fraction number. It's 1 over something. So I typically like to keep my shutter speed just at a starting point, about 1 over 125, maybe 1 over 160. A good rule of thumb is to double your focal length of your lens for that bottom number. Let's say you shoot with a 50mm. You want to double that, so 50 doubled is 100, and make that your bottom number of your shutter. So 1 over 100 would be the lowest that I would go with a 50mm. I would not go any lower because you're going to have problems getting your images in focus. I like to go a little bit higher because I have a squirmy kid, and so to get her in focus, I have to have my shutter speed higher or faster. So the way that shutter speed works is the higher the number, the faster your shutter speed is. The lower the number, the slower your shutter speed is. Now here's where lighting comes in. The faster the shutter speed, the less amount of light that's allowed in, and the darker your photo will be. The slower the shutter speed, the more amount of light is let into your lens, therefore your picture is brighter. So there's the give and the take again. You can have a slower shutter speed to get more light, but you're gonna have less in focus or less chance of catching that focus. When you go higher shutter speed, you'll catch the tack sharp focus, but it'll be a darker picture. That's when you get to play with your ISO. That's the next thing that I set. So ISO is that number that ranges from 100 to about 3200. On other camera bodies, it may go higher, but that's your ISO. That determines the overall amount of light that is let into your lens. So if you have a lower ISO number, that means that the overall picture is going to be darker. When you have a higher ISO number, the overall picture is going to be brighter, but the higher that you go in your ISO, the more grain that's allowed into your picture. So your picture quality will suffer if you do go too high. Now with newer camera bodies, they are much more capable of going into higher ISO without seeing that grain. But with most of you guys have some starter bodies, those are the ones that tend to see the most struggle in the higher ISO. So when you're choosing your ISO, I like to start, if I'm outside, start at about 100. Sometimes I start at 200 if it's a little bit of an overcast day. If you're inside, start maybe about 1600 if you're not using a flash. The higher that you go above 1600, you really start to see that grain introduced into the picture. And so I try to start at 1600 and I only bump up if I have to. So one thing that I need you to understand is that ISO, shutter speed, and your aperture all go hand in hand. And so if you bring, let's say, your shutter speed up because you need a faster shutter to catch something in focus, that means your picture is going to be darker. So you then have to adjust your ISO, bring that up to make your picture brighter. Again, I don't really like to touch my aperture, so I have only two variables, my ISO and my shutter speed. Here's another example. If you want to bring your ISO down so that not as much grain is introduced, that means the overall picture is going to be darker. You're going to have to take your shutter speed and bring it down so that more light is allowed into your picture. So lower ISO means lower shutter speed so that more light is allowed into your picture. Anytime you adjust your ISO or your shutter speed, you need to adjust the other one to compensate. So if you adjust your ISO and it makes the picture too dark, adjust your shutter speed to make it brighter. If you adjust your shutter speed and it makes your picture too dark, adjust your ISO. They go hand in hand every which way that you operate them. So one thing that you can practice this week is adjusting those things one at a time. So your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed. I would pick two to leave the same and just play with one at a time. So let's say you want to leave your aperture and your shutter speed alone, but you want to see what happens when you raise and lower your ISO. Do that. Take a test shot at the lowest ISO, take a test shot at the highest ISO, and see how that affects your camera. See how it affects your picture. If you want to see what your shutter speed does to affect your picture, keep your aperture and your ISO the same and play with your shutter speed. Move your shutter speed way fast. See what happens. Move your shutter speed way low and see what happens. It's really fun to play with these settings, and the more that you understand the way that they affect each other, the better you're going to be able to decide how they work together. So again, here's the way that I set my settings. I set my aperture and I don't touch it. Typically for the whole session, I don't touch it. Next, I set my shutter speed. I try to set it at about 125 to 160. I don't like going much slower than 125. The next thing that I set is my ISO. If I'm outside and it's a sunny day, I start my ISO about 100, sometimes 200. Then what I do is I snap my picture and see what it looks like, because this is all trial and error to set your best settings for that moment. So once I look at the picture, if I say, wow, this picture is not bright enough, I'll up my ISO. That's the easiest thing to do. And if I have room to up my ISO without it affecting the picture to make it grainy, I do it. So I'll up my ISO and I'll take another picture. Let's say you had to bump your ISO up because you're indoors, or maybe you're outside and it's a pretty dark, gloomy day. If you already have a higher ISO and you take your picture and it's still too dark, head to your shutter speed. You can then slow your shutter speed so that it allows more light in. So really, what you need to remember about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture is what happens when you move it up or down. If your aperture is low, more light is allowed in. If your aperture is high, less light is allowed in. If your shutter speed is slow with a lower number, it's gonna be brighter. If your shutter speed is high or faster, it's gonna be darker. If your ISO is low, it's gonna be darker. If your ISO is high, it's gonna be lighter. When you can remember those things, you'll be able to set the settings on your camera. I hope this helps. Again, if you need to remember the order to set things, aperture first, shutter speed, ISO, and then back to shutter speed if you have to. I hope this helps. Go out and practice. It's going to be a great week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I would be glad to help you answer any questions that you have. What would help me the most to help you is if you snap a picture and you're not sure how to fix it, show me what your settings were at that time. Then I'll be able to tell you what to adjust to make the outcome that you're wanting. I'm excited to see the progress that you're gonna make this week. Don't be overwhelmed. Really, it's not that difficult once you really have an understanding of it. For those of you that are more visual learners, I'll be sending out a post tomorrow for you to access that'll give you a rundown of what we went over today in writing. It'll also have some charts for you to visually see what happens when you adjust your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. I look forward to what this week's gonna bring. See you soon.